John Steinbeck was 36 years old in 1938 when he began the novel. He had already written Of Mice and Men. He had already written Tortilla Flat. He was living in Los Gatos, California, with his first wife Carol Henning. And he had spent the previous 2 years reporting on the Central Valley for the San Francisco News. He had gone into the migrant camps. He had gone into the government-run federal camps at Weed Patch and Arvin. He had gone into the private grower camps, where the wages were being suppressed by the sheer number of families arriving from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas. He had watched children die of preventable diseases. He had watched families paying rent to live in what was essentially open ground. He had watched the same growers who were paying starvation wages complain publicly about a labor shortage. His 7 articles from that reporting were published in the San Francisco News in October 1936 under the title, The Harvest Gypsies. They were reprinted the next year as a pamphlet called Their Blood is Strong. The pamphlet is dry, factual, and enraged. It is the raw material of the novel he was about to write. By 1938, he had also seen the aerial photographs of the Dust Bowl and knew where the migrants were coming from. He knew about the drought. He knew about the mechanization, the tractor that could farm 1,000 acres and put 20 tenant families off their land. He had the whole system in view. He sat down. He wrote The Grapes of Wrath in 5 months. He finished in late October 1938. Now the standard reading of the book. The standard reading says, The Grapes of Wrath is a novel about the Dust Bowl. It is about a poor family from Oklahoma, the Jodes, who lose their farm to bank foreclosure and drought. They pack up in a Hudson Super 6 converted into a truck. They drive down Route 66. They reach California. California turns out not to be paradise. They suffer. Grandma Jode dies. Grandpa Jode dies. Rose of Sharon's baby is stillborn. Tom Jode kills a policeman and has to run. And at the end, in a barn in the rain, Rose of Sharon nurses a starving stranger back to life at her own breast. All of that is in the book. All of that happened, more or less, to real families in the real 1930s. But if you read the novel as a period piece, as a documentary reconstruction of what happened to Okies in California in the 1930s, you are reading it flat. Because Steinbeck is not interested in what happened to Okies in California in the 1930s. He is interested in what makes any migration like it possible in any decade. And the answer, in Steinbeck's argument, is that private property is a story. Consider what actually happens when the Jodes are pushed off their land. It is not a natural disaster. It is a legal transaction. A bank, in a distant city, decides the loan on the Jode farm is uneconomic. A tractor is dispatched. A neighbor, hired by the bank, drives the tractor over the porch of the Jode house and knocks it down. The neighbor is not a bad man. He has 3 kids to feed. The bank is not a person at all. When the Jodes ask who is doing this to them, and who they can shoot, and who they can fight, the neighbor tells them, nobody. The bank is nobody. There is no man to shoot. There is a piece of paper in an office somewhere that says the land is not theirs anymore, and there is a system of enforcement that will send tractors and sheriffs and, if necessary, the Oklahoma National Guard. Steinbeck writes this scene early. It is chapter 5. The whole rest of the novel is played against that opening. Because what the Jodes learn on the road to California is that this is not a local problem. It is the entire structure. In Arizona, they are turned around at borders they did not know existed. In California, they arrive at the Colorado River and are met by armed guards who do not want them to cross. Then they arrive at valleys they have been promised are full of work, and find that the work pays 25 cents an hour, and then 15 cents, and then 5, because there are 20 families for every job. Then they arrive at ditch camps that the private growers periodically burn. Then they arrive at a government camp, Weed Patch, that is a small island of dignity, and then they are told the camp cannot hold them all. None of that is Dust Bowl. That is the enforcement of property. That is what happens when a large economy makes the collective decision that land, water, food, and shelter belong to whoever holds the paper, and that people who do not hold the paper have no claim on any of it. And here is where the standard reading collapses. Because Ma Jode's most famous speech, the one taught in high school anthologies, is not really about resilience. It is about class. Late in the novel, she says, "We're the people that live. They can't wipe us out. They can't lick us. We'll go on forever, 'cause we're the people." That "we" is not Okies. It is not white migrant farmers. We is anyone whose survival depends on labor rather than property. They is anyone whose position depends on property rather than labor. Ma Jode is drawing a line down the middle of a country, a line she did not draw, that was drawn for her by the tractor coming over the porch, and she is naming which side she is on. That is not a depression sentence. That is a sentence about how societies actually work when the polite fictions have been stripped away. And that is what Steinbeck was saying that Kern County did not want said out loud. Susan Schillinglaw, in her 2014 book on Reading the Grapes of Wrath, points out that Steinbeck was very deliberately weaving in intercalary chapters, the short lyrical chapters that alternate with the Jode narrative, precisely because he did not want the reader to think this was only the Jode story. Chapter 7 is not about the Jodes. It is about used car salesmen selling wrecks to migrant families. Chapter 15 is not about the Jodes. It is about a diner on Route 66 where a waitress gives away a loaf of bread cheap because she has understood something the manager has not. Chapter 19 is not about the Jodes. It is a compressed history of California land, Mexican, then Spanish, then American, then corporate, designed to make clear that the state the Jodes are entering has changed hands many times and by force each time. The intercalary chapters exist to universalize the Jode story. To say, this is not one family. This is what a system does. This is what the paper says. The FBI file on Steinbeck, declassified in 1984, is 122 pages long. Most of it is banal, reports on his political associations, on his 1948 trip to the Soviet Union with Robert Capa, on rumors about his second wife Gwyn. But J. Edgar Hoover's initial interest was clear. Steinbeck was a suspected communist. His novel had made an argument that could be mistaken for a Marxist argument, that property is a story enforced by violence, and that the class that owns nothing has to organize together to survive. Steinbeck was not a communist. He was a New Deal liberal, closer in his politics to Franklin Roosevelt than to any organized left. Roosevelt, in fact, received him at the White House and thanked him for the book. Steinbeck's argument was not that the property system should be overthrown. His argument was that the property system, as it stood, was inhumane, and that America, the actual America of Ma Jode and the guys running the government camp at Weed Patch, was better than what the property system was allowing to happen. That distinction did not matter to Hoover. It did not matter to Kern County. If you point out that a system produces avoidable suffering, the system does not always distinguish between reformist critics and revolutionary ones. Both get files. Which is why the book reads louder now than it has in 50 years. Because the specific historical moment, Dust Bowl migration to California in the 1930s, is over. But the underlying pattern the novel describes is not. Americans are again being priced out of the towns they were born in. Housing has again become a paper problem, held by entities that are not people, enforceable in courtrooms most people cannot afford to enter. There are again tent encampments outside the cities that produce the wealth. There is again a widening class of people whose survival depends on labor in a market that keeps deciding they are worth less. The Grapes of Wrath is not a period piece. It is a manual. It is the story of what a family looks like the moment it realizes that the story of the country it belongs to has a page in it about them, and the page is not favorable, and there is nowhere to appeal. Ma Jode is right. They are the people. They go on forever. But the question the novel leaves open is, on what terms? If this changed how you think about the Grapes of Wrath, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think. Cormac Mccarthy had two other sons before John. One of them, Cullen, was born in 1962 to McCarthy's first wife, Lee Holloman. That marriage ended in the mid-1960s. His second son, Curtis, was to a subsequent partner. By the time John came along in 1998, McCarthy was 65, and there was a real chance he would not see the boy graduate from anything. He knew it. His wife Jennifer Winkley, 36 years younger, knew it. And by the time he sat down in 2005 and 2006 to write the book, he was writing it, explicitly, for John. The Road is dedicated, for John Francis McCarthy. Most McCarthy novels are dedicated to editors, or to no one. This one has a name. And the boy in the novel, the son of the unnamed father, the child at the center of the whole devastated landscape, the father sometimes calls him the boy. Sometimes he calls him my child, my only child. Sometimes he calls him him. The boy is never given a name in the entire book. The father is also never named. Neither is the mother, who has already killed herself before the novel begins. Neither is anyone else the pair meet on the road. Readers have offered dozens of theories about why. Some think the anonymity is meant to make the story universal. Some think it is because a name would require a past, and the father and boy live in a present so obliterated that names are irrelevant. Both of those theories are true, and neither of them is enough. The real answer is that a father, when he writes a book for the child he thinks he will not outlive, does not need to use the child's name. The child knows who the boy is. The book is already addressed to him. The Road is set an unspecified number of years after an unspecified catastrophe. There is a burnt landscape. There are ashes falling constantly. The sun is gone. Nothing grows. There are cannibals. There are refugees. Nobody explains what happened. McCarthy was asked in the 2007 Oprah interview what the event was. He said he didn't know. He said it didn't matter. He suggested it might be a meteor. He suggested he had thought about nuclear war. He said the causes of catastrophes are the least interesting part. This drove science fiction readers crazy. Because in science fiction, the cause of the catastrophe is the whole point. Cause determines meaning. Cause determines what humanity did wrong. Cause determines what the survivor should learn. McCarthy is not writing science fiction. He is refusing that whole tradition. The catastrophe in The Road is not something humanity did wrong. It is something that simply happens. It is death 1 degree removed. The specific mechanism is not the point. The point is, a father and his boy are walking south because the winters where they are will kill them. They have a shopping cart with everything they own. The father has a pistol with 2 bullets. If they are captured, 1 bullet is for the boy. That is not a metaphor. That is a plot detail, established in the first 15 pages. That is the world McCarthy has built around the boy who is walking with his father, and the father who knows the whole trip is a rehearsal. Now the standard reading. The standard reading of The Road says the novel is about the persistence of moral light in a dark world. The father and the boy are the good guys. They carry the fire. That phrase the boy asks repeatedly, "Are we still the good guys? And we're still carrying the fire, right?" And the father says yes, becomes the moral heart of most classroom discussions of the book. That reading is not wrong. It is also not sufficient. Because if the novel were only about moral persistence in a dark world, the father would not have to die. But the father does die. The last 20 pages of the book are the father dying of pneumonia or a bullet wound on the coast, and then the boy alone. And that is where the argument the novel is actually making shows its full shape. Because carrying the fire is not survival. Survival is what the father tries to give the boy, and it is not what he manages to give him. What the father manages to give him is the phrase itself. The metaphor. The idea that there is a fire and the boy is one of the ones who carries it. That is what the boy has left when the father dies. Not the pistol. Not the map. Not a set of survival skills. The boy is 9 years old, and he is not going to survive by his own competence. He is going to survive, if he survives at all, because his father spent the last months of his life telling him a story about who he was. About what the boy carried. About what he was for. That is not survival. That is transmission. And here's what nobody quite says out loud about McCarthy's work. Every one of his major novels is a father-son novel. Blood Meridian is a novel about the kid No Name, Always the Kid, and Judge Holden, a monstrous surrogate father figure who is instructing him in the metaphysics of violence. Suttree is about a man estranged from his own father and his own son. All the Pretty Horses and No Country for Old Men both center on fathers who cannot save their sons and sons who cannot become their fathers. McCarthy circled the father-son relationship for 40 years. He wrote around it. He wrote through it. He wrote violent men and violent landscapes and hallucinatory judges and Texas Rangers and horse thieves, but at the center of every one of them was the question of what a father can give a son and what he cannot. The Road is the one where he stopped hiding it. It is the one where he took the father-son relationship out of allegory and put it on the page directly. A man walking with his son through a country that is going to kill them both. A man who knows he will not outlive the child. A man who is trying, in the time he has left, to transmit something the child can carry forward on his own. Which is what any father is in any world. The ash and the cannibals in The Road are not the subject. They are the setting cranked to the maximum so that the underlying subject becomes impossible to miss. Every parent, in every ordinary world, is doing exactly what the man in The Road is doing. They know they will not outlive the child, or at least should not. They are trying, in the time they have, to hand down something the child can carry. That is what carrying the fire means. It is not the good guys keep going. It is the boy still has the story when the father is gone. McCarthy died on the 13th of June, 2023, at his home in Santa Fe. He was 89 years old. John, the boy the book was for, was 25. They had had 25 years together. Every one of them was more than the man who wrote the book had expected. Read The Road again. Not as a novel about the world ending. Read it as a novel about the fact that every parent's world ends, exactly on schedule, and that the whole of parenthood is the argument for what should still be walking when it does. That is what McCarthy was writing about in that El Paso hotel room in 2003. That is what he handed down. If this changed how you think about The Road, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think. Let's start with the day. Joyce could have set the novel on any day of any year. He was writing it between 1914 and 1921. He chose the 16th of June, 1904, and he chose it deliberately. That was the day, in Dublin, that he first walked out with a red-haired chambermaid from Galway named Nora Barnacle. They had met the week before on Nassau Street. She had, apparently, thought he was a Norwegian sailor. June the 16th, 1904, was the day Joyce fell in love with the woman he would live with and eventually marry for the rest of his life. In the private mythology of the man, it was the day the future began. And the book he wrote about that day is not about Nora and is not obviously about love. It is about a middle-aged Dublin advertising canvasser named Leopold Bloom, walking around the city while his wife Molly, at home, prepares to have an affair with a man named Blazes Boylan at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It is about a young writer named Stephen Dedalus, drunk and grieving his dead mother, wandering the same city. It is about their paths, which cross and recross all day, and finally meet in a brothel and in a kitchen at 2 in the morning. The choice of Bloomsday as Joyce's own private anniversary is the first joke of the novel. Everything in the world can happen on any day. The day that was meant to be the day Joyce was reborn, the day he chose, in retrospect, as the beginning of his adult life, was also, in the book, an entirely ordinary day in which nothing much happens and a man's wife cheats on him. There is a case to be made that Ulysses is the greatest love letter in 20th century literature. It is written in code. The 18 episodes of Ulysses map, loosely, to the 18 books of Homer's Odyssey. Bloom is Odysseus, Molly is Penelope, Stephen is Telemachus. That much is famous. That much is on every textbook chart. What the textbooks tend to underplay is that each episode is written in a completely different literary style. Episode 1, Telemachus, reads like a well-made Edwardian novel. Third person, clean prose, dialogue tags, weather. Perfectly conventional. Episode 7, Ulysses, is set inside a newspaper office and is written as newspaper copy, with headlines cutting into the narrative every few paragraphs. Episode 11, Sirens, is set in a bar and is written to imitate music, with themes and variations and a coda, opening with a tuning-up section of fragments that do not resolve until later in the chapter. Episode 14, Oxen of the Sun is set in a maternity hospital and is written as a chronological history of English prose style, moving from Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse through Chaucer, Malory, Elizabethan drama, 17th century Latinate rhetoric, 18th century satire, Victorian sentimentality, and finally into the drunken slang of modern Dublin. The chapter enacts the growth of an embryo through the growth of English itself. Episode 15, Circe, is written as a hallucinatory stage play, hundreds of pages long, in which the characters, objects, and even ideas take on speaking parts. By the time you reach episode 18, Molly's soliloquy, you have been through so many styles that the mind is prepared, finally, for the possibility that prose can do without punctuation altogether. Because the mind, thinking to itself in bed at 2 in the morning, does not punctuate. And here is where the standard reading of Ulysses collapses. Ulysses is not difficult because Joyce was showing off. That is the accusation most often thrown at it. That it is a Chinese puzzle box built by a man who wanted to be admired for the difficulty of the puzzle. Joyce himself once said, half-jokingly, that he had put in so many enigmas and puzzles that the book would keep the professors busy for centuries, and that this was the only way of ensuring one's immortality. But the joke conceals the point. Ulysses is difficult because Joyce was trying to prove something. He was trying to prove that any single day, a random Thursday in a middling city in 1904 contains everything. The whole Odyssey. The whole of English literature. The whole of the human body, chapter by chapter, with each episode assigned an organ. Every meal, every bowel movement, every argument in a pub, every song in a bar, every menstrual pain, every prayer, every act of adultery, every death of a father. And no ordinary prose sentence can carry the weight of what a single day actually contains. If you are going to write an honest day, Joyce is saying, you cannot write it in one voice. You have to write it in every voice. Because a day is not one voice, a day is the newspaper you read in the morning, the music you hear in the afternoon, the medical textbook you consult when your wife is pregnant, the theater you attend at night, the private torrent of thought you fall asleep in. The difficulty is the argument. If Ulysses were easy, it would be lying about what a day is. Which brings us to the ban. In 1920 and 1921, before the book was even complete, the American magazine The Little Review had begun publishing episodes of Ulysses in serial form. The New York Society for the Suppression of Vice took them to court. 2 of the magazine's editors were fined $100 for publishing episode 13, Nausicaa, which contains a scene of Bloom masturbating on a beach while watching a young woman named Gertie McDowell. That verdict effectively banned Ulysses in the United States. Any copy that arrived through customs was seized and burned. In 1923, in London, 500 copies of the second edition were burned by customs at Folkestone. In 1926, in New York, a similar shipment. For 11 years, if you wanted to read Ulysses in America, you had to smuggle it across the border. Copies came in from Paris wrapped in the covers of Shakespeare's works, or in false plaster busts, or bound into fake dictionaries. Then, in 1933, the publisher Random House, wanting the American rights, deliberately arranged for a copy of Ulysses to be intercepted at the port of New York. They brought a test case, United States v. One book called Ulysses. The case went to Judge John M. Woolsey of the Southern District of New York. On December 6, 1933, Judge Woolsey delivered an opinion that changed American publishing forever. He wrote that although the book contained many words usually considered dirty, these were the words that the persons Joyce is seeking to describe would actually use. He noted that the book was not written for its dirt. He wrote, "This is the famous line that in Ulysses, in spite of its unusual frankness, I do not detect anywhere the leer of the sensualist." He ruled that Ulysses was not obscene and could be legally imported and sold in the United States. That opinion cleared the way for Faulkner, for Hemingway's more explicit passages, for Henry Miller when he came, for Nabokov when he came. Every serious American book you can name that has a body in it is downstream of Judge Woolsey's December 1933 opinion. Modernist prose, in America, was legalized by one federal judge sitting alone in a Manhattan chambers reading a novel about a Dubliner masturbating on a beach. The book Joyce wrote about a single day in a city he had left made itself indispensable. It sits at the exact hinge of the 20th century. Before Ulysses, the novel was one thing. After Ulysses, it was another. And the argument is not that you have to like it. Plenty of great readers do not. The argument is that the difficulty is not vanity. The difficulty is Joyce insisting that a day, honestly rendered, is bigger than one style can hold. Molly's final sentence, "Yes, I said yes, I will yes," is what happens when you have been through 18 styles and finally arrive at a woman thinking her way toward the memory of the day her husband first proposed to her on Howth Head in Dublin, and she said yes. The book that took 7 years to write about one day ends on a woman saying yes to a memory of a moment that has already happened. That is the whole of Ulysses in one sentence. That is Joyce writing Nora, in code, into the last page of the biggest book of the 20th century. If this changed how you think about Ulysses, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think. To understand the book, you need to know what Fitzgerald was living while he wrote it. In April 1930, Zelda Fitzgerald suffered her first psychotic break in Paris. She was diagnosed at the Malmaison Clinic. Later that year at Prangens in Switzerland, she received the diagnosis of schizophrenia. She would spend most of the rest of her life in institutions. She died in a hospital fire in Asheville, North Carolina, in 1948, locked into her ward. Fitzgerald spent those years drinking, writing short stories at $3,000 apiece for the Saturday Evening Post to pay for her treatment, and trying to finish a novel he could not finish. He had started it in 1925, right after Gatsby. He had begun with a version about a young Hollywood technician who murders his mother. He had thrown that away. He had begun again with a version about a French Riviera couple. He had thrown parts of that away. By 1932, he had drafted the novel 4 separate ways. He wrote to Perkins that year, "The novel now plans to be laid on the Riviera and in Switzerland, the setting familiar to me and to a wide public." Familiar. That word matters. He was writing the Riviera he and Zelda had actually lived on. He was writing the Swiss clinic where Zelda had actually been institutionalized. Dick Diver, the doomed psychiatrist at the center of the novel, marries Nicole Warren, a beautiful schizophrenic patient who is also the heiress to a Chicago fortune. He becomes her doctor and her husband simultaneously, and his marriage becomes indistinguishable from his practice. But that reading, the reading that says Nicole is Zelda and Dick is Scott, is only the beginning of what the novel is. Tender is the Night was published on April 12, 1934. Reviews were mixed. Some critics thought it was Fitzgerald's best work. Many thought it was structurally broken. It sold about 12,000 copies in its first year, a fraction of what Gatsby had done, which itself had been considered a disappointment. Fitzgerald was crushed. He was 6 years from his death of a heart attack in Hollywood at 44. He never wrote another completed novel. The Last Tycoon, when he died, was still in fragments. And here is where the strangeness begins. Because the reason the book got called structurally broken is that it does not begin with Dick Diver. It begins with a young American actress named Rosemary Hoyt, who arrives at a Riviera beach in 1925 and falls in love with a beautiful, glittering couple, Dick and Nicole Diver, at the height of their charm. She thinks they are the most enchanting people she has ever seen. Only later, Book 2, does the novel flash back 7 years to show us how Dick met Nicole in the Swiss clinic, how their marriage began under the sign of her illness, how the golden couple was in fact built on a psychiatric relationship. And in Book 3, we watch the golden couple dissolve. Dick's competence falls apart. He drinks. He fails. Nicole recovers, precisely as Dick fails, because she was drawing her stability from him the whole time, and when there is nothing left to draw, she is finally strong. Dick vanishes into a series of smaller and smaller American towns, sending Christmas cards from a place called Batavia, New York. then Lockport, then Geneva, and then nothing. The novel closes with Nicole receiving no more letters. Dick has become a rumor. And here's what the standard reading of that structure misses. Fitzgerald did not open with the beach in 1925 by accident. He opened there because the whole moral horror of the book depends on our first seeing Dick and Nicole through the eyes of a 19-year-old girl who has no idea what she is looking at. Rosemary sees a golden couple. We are meant to see a golden couple. And then, 300 pages later, we look back at that opening scene and we understand exactly what Rosemary was watching. She was watching a psychiatrist and his patient perform charm at the edge of a collapse. That is the argument of Tender is the Night. That is why it works. That is why the flashback structure is not a flaw, it is the whole point. Gatsby is a diamond. Tender is the Night is what happens when a man tries to write his own dissolution and lets the wound stay open. Gatsby is the American myth pressed into 200 pages so hard it becomes symbolic. Tender is the myth from inside, unedited. With all the drunkenness and the money and the 2-year affairs and the wife who is also a case and the husband who is also a doctor and the way 3 of those years happen in Cannes and 2 of them happen in Munich and 1 of them happens in Rome getting beaten up by carabinieri in a police station. Gatsby has the perfection of the artist in his early prime. Tender has the truth of the artist in his late collapse, and that truth is bigger. Then came 1948. Scott Fitzgerald had been dead for 8 years. Zelda had died 3 months earlier in the hospital fire. Malcolm Cowley, the literary critic, was preparing a posthumous edition of Tender is the Night for Scribner. And Cowley had a document. Fitzgerald, in the years after the novel's disappointing reception, had marked up a copy of the 1934 edition. In his own hand, he had written a proposed reordering. The novel should begin, he suggested, with Dick meeting Nicole in the Swiss clinic in 1917. Then move forward chronologically. The flashback structure should be undone. The Riviera opening should come later. Fitzgerald had written a note on this rearranged copy. This is the final version of the book as I would like it. Cowley took that note at face value. He published the 1948 edition in the chronological order Fitzgerald had proposed. For decades, that was the version most Americans read. High school anthologies used it. Paperback editions used it. It was called, on the copyright page, the author's final version. And it destroyed the book. Because when you tell the story chronologically, you lose Rosemary. You lose the beach in 1925. You lose the moment when a young girl looks at a golden couple and mistakes an illness for enchantment, and you lose the moment, 300 pages later, when we understand what we were looking at. The flashback is the argument. Chronological order kills the argument. Matthew Broccoli, the great Fitzgerald scholar, spent much of the 1950s and 1960s arguing this point. He restored the 1934 order in his 1951 edition. Most modern serious editions, the Cambridge University Press edition, the Everyman, the Modern Library restore the 1934 version now. But the chronological version is still floating around in used bookstores. If you find a Tender is the Night in a Goodwill for $2, check which one you're holding. If book 1 is a Swiss clinic in 1917, put it back. Read the 1934 version. Read the one Rosemary opens. Read the one where the wound stays open. Read the one Fitzgerald finished when he was still alive to defend it, and not the one Cowley published when he was in the ground and could not answer back. Tender is the Night is not a well-behaved book. It sprawls. It doubles back. It has whole chapters about a party and can that have almost no plot function and enormous emotional weight. It is the novel of a man who used up 9 years and 17 drafts trying to tell the truth about his own life, while his wife was in a clinic and his talent was going. Gatsby is a masterpiece of restraint. Tender is the Night is a masterpiece of exhaustion. And the exhaustion is a subject only one American novelist ever wrote from the inside, because it took him. If this changed how you think about Fitzgerald, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like, it helps the channel more than you think. Chinua Achebe was born in 1930 in Ajadi, in what was then the British colony of Nigeria. His father was a catechist for the Church Missionary Society. His first language was Igbo. His second language, from the age of 8, was English. He was the fifth of 6 children and the first in his family to go to university. He read Heart of Darkness as a student at University College Ibadan. He read it, at first, the way an African student was supposed to read it, as a masterpiece. As a great humane critique of European imperialism. Conrad, after all, was the writer who had put the words the horror, into the mouth of Mr. Kurtz. The writer who seemed to be exposing what Europe had done to the Congo. And then, at some point, Achebe stopped reading it that way. He noticed something. He noticed that the Africans in Heart of Darkness are not characters. They are scenery. They do not speak, except in grunts. They exist to reflect the moral condition of the white man moving through them. Kurtz's soul is the subject. The African forest, the African bodies, the African river, these are the mirror in which the European sees himself. Achebe would later say, "What makes Heart of Darkness offensive is not that it depicts Africa as a place of darkness. It is that it depicts Africa as a place with no human beings in it." He decided to write the book that put the human beings back. But here's what most readers miss about that decision. The Umofia of Things Fall Apart is not a paradise. Achebe took great pains to make sure of that. This is not a novel about noble savages destroyed by wicked colonizers. This is a novel about a specific, complicated, structured human society, with laws, with a judicial system, with poetry, with philosophy, with cruelty, with contradictions. Twins in Umofia are considered abominations. They are placed in earthenware pots and left to die in the evil forest. A man named Ikamafuna, given to Umofia as a peace child from another village, lives with Okonkwo's family for 3 years, long enough for Okonkwo's son Noi to call him brother. When the oracle decrees that Ikamafuna must be killed, the wise elder Ogwefi Azuda warns Okonkwo not to be the one who does it. "The boy calls you father. Do not bear a hand in his death." Okonkwo goes anyway. And when the boy runs to him, wounded and calling him father, Okonkwo cuts him down with his machete, not because he must, but because he was afraid of being thought weak. This is Chapter 7. It is 140 pages before the first white missionary appears. The village that Achebe builds for us is a real village. It has a great deal that is admirable and a great deal that is horrifying. Any honest reader closes the first third of the book knowing that Umofia's collapse cannot be entirely blamed on outsiders. And that's where the standard interpretation starts to collapse. Because Okonkwo, the man at the center of the novel, is not a figure of Igbo excellence. He is a figure of Igbo excess. Achebe gives us his motivation on page 1. Okonkwo's father, Anoka, was a musician, a man of debts. A man who preferred palm wine and flute playing to yam farming. A man the village considered a failure because he did not accumulate, did not fight, did not build. When he died, he was carried into the evil forest to rot because he had died of the swelling sickness and was not fit for burial. Okonkwo spends his entire life trying not to be his father. Everything he does, every wrestling match he wins, every war he fights in, every yam he grows, every wife he beats, every son he shouts at, every softness he suppresses, is calibrated against Anoka. Okonkwo is a man built entirely on the negation of his father. He has no self except the refusal to be the man who made him. And here's what that means for the book. Long before the missionaries arrive, Okonkwo is already breaking. He kills Ikamafuna and cannot eat for 2 days. He accidentally shoots the son of Ogwefi Azudu at the funeral and is exiled from Umofia for 7 years. His own son, Nwoi, is drawn to the gentle strangeness of the new Christian religion, not because it is superior, but because it does not require him to be the man his father demands he be. Nwoi leaves Okonkwo before the empire arrives. The pattern of Okonkwo's life was not written by British colonial policy. It was written by the way Okonkwo constructed his own manhood. Colonialism is the historical shock he happens to face. But the argument the novel is making is that he would have broken against any shock large enough, because a self built on refusal cannot bend. This is why Achebe's title is what it is. Things Fall Apart comes from Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, written in 1919. The full line is, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold." Yeats was writing about the collapse of European civilization after the First World War. The center that could not hold was the whole moral architecture of a continent. Achebe takes the line and points it at a village. And also at a man. And the trick of the novel is that it works for both. The center that cannot hold, in Things Fall Apart, is not primarily the Igbo world. The Igbo world is battered, but still real. Some of it survives, some of it transforms, some of it hides inside Christianity and waits for 150 years. Chinua Achebe himself, writing in Igbo and English, is proof that the center held enough. The center that cannot hold, in the strictest sense, is Okonkwo. His masculinity, his refusal of his father, his one available emotional register, controlled violence, cannot survive a world in which the old rules no longer apply. And that's why he hangs himself. Not because Umwofia is destroyed. Umwofia is not destroyed. It is changed. His son is a Christian. His people are negotiating with the district commissioner. The world is being remade around him, and he cannot participate in the remaking, because everything he is a refusal of his father, and the world of his father is going. Suicide in Umwofia is an abomination. His body cannot be buried by his kinsmen. He ends the novel the way his father did, carried out into the evil forest, unclean, unwelcome, a shame. The circle closes. Okonkwo has become an Oka. The book ends with one of the most quietly devastating final paragraphs in 20th century fiction. The district commissioner, standing over Okonkwo's body, thinks about the book he is going to write. A book about his years pacifying the primitive tribes of the lower Niger. He thinks Okonkwo's story might be worth a paragraph. Perhaps a whole chapter. Certainly not more. Achebe has just spent 200 pages giving us Okonkwo's inner life, his family, his village, his rituals, his oral history, his poetry, his wars, his weaknesses. And in the final sentence, the whole of it is compressed into a colonial officer's mental sketch of a paragraph he will never bother to write. That is the answer to Conrad. That is what Achebe was doing all along. He was showing us, for 200 pages, the interior a European writer would compress into a paragraph and dismiss. The book is not primarily an argument about colonialism. It is an argument about who is granted an interior. Who is allowed to be a person on the page. Who is allowed to be tragic in a way that matters. Okonkwo is a violent, controlling, ultimately broken man. Achebe does not spare him. Achebe does not make him lovable. Achebe makes him a person, because a person is exactly what Heart of Darkness refused to make him. If this changed how you think about Things Fall Apart, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think.